Um, okay, so moving on. So basically, with regards to um, the effect of mainstream media and I guess the mainstream media bias, um, I think we've been talking about the Korean example, which I think we've kind of established that in general, Korean mainstream media tends to follow the colors of the government, of the
Mm,
administration that currently has power. Obviously, there are exceptions, but I think in general terms. And I think if we were to look at a slightly different example, which is the American example, and you can disagree with me at any time about anything that I'm saying, but then the way that I see the American news media is that there are private companies there are news sources and they have very specific colors, and that doesn't
mm.
change even if the administration changes, even as time passes. For example, CNN, they have a
Mhm.
very specific target audience. They have a very specific agenda and color. Fox News, great example, very specific color.
Mm,
I don't think they've changed or that they're going to be changing anytime soon.
mhm.
So between those two different options of the Korean mainstream media and the American mainstream media, which one would you say is more preferable in a society?
I definitely think it's American like media. It's because you have a clear choice. Although sometimes the media itself could be overly exaggerated or overly radical, but you still have a choice. You still have a clear choice and you can make a choice like based on your standards. And because those like medias don't get influenced like whether the situation, what situation they're in, it really gives like the people, like people from US to allow them to have like their voice. It's not a wrong thing to have your voice and to go against the government or go against anything because there are these two big or like several big voices as media and that supports your stance. So I think that's way more healthier because you can make a free choice of it.
But I think if I can kind of throw a opposing viewpoint,
Mhm.
wouldn't you say that although of course it is ideal if we have a diverse range of news sources that can kind of advocate for all of the different perspectives represented in actual society, um, in the case of America, for example, right now we would say that America is a very polarized country, politically
Right.
speaking,
Mhm.
and really just overall with a
Mhm.
lot of social issues. It's very polarized, so we call it hyper polarized, where people have very extreme views. Or at the
Mhm.
very least, the mainstream media has very extreme views, and they represent those views.
Right.
So, do you think that um, that is still preferable over, let's say, having multiple different news sources that may not be as diverse in terms of the voices that they represent, but they're much less radical in those viewpoints?
I mean, I agree that as I mentioned, like some of the media in America is too radical. I agree. And it sometimes brings to negative implications of maybe having too much like radical point of view, which might cause, I don't know, violence or like and not being able to agree to any part of the other side just because you're a certain color. I think that's wrong and that's not a healthy thing that media should do. But however, I I still think it's better than having less radical views and not having a clear stance because I think it can't be not radical if you have a clear stance because more you talk about it and more you have develop your own opinions and colors. Not that like everyone like liking or favoring a certain color is radical, but like it's just how persuading and how like broadcasting works. the more you talk about your subject or your stance, you become more into it. And I guess it's based on the individuals and audience who gets it, because like, I mean, there's still a whole lot of people who makes the correct decisions not being radical. And I think the reason they're being able to do that is because, psychologically, like there's this more people that will agree to you. And these kind of like knowing this will really help you make a voice, because like sometimes like just in our like daily basis, if you know that this something you say right now will cause everyone to oppose to you, and everyone will like bring rebuttals to you, it's really going to be hesitant for me to speak my stance, because knowing that really brings, and knowing that like, and speaking really needs a big courage to do that. But if you don't have these like radical views next to you, and like that's supporting you, then it will be harder for citizens to make their like own choice, I guess, in smaller issues or bigger issues.
But I think obviously it would be easier for people to interact, to encounter different
Mhm.
perspectives if they are supported by those news sources, or at the very least they can look to those news sources
Right, right.
and realize that they're not the only one thinking the way that they're thinking.
Mhm.
But the example that you gave of people feeling, I guess, less hesitant to speak their voice as a result of having a news source that's representing a similar viewpoint to them, wouldn't you say that that's more a question of the environment that that particular individual happens to be in at that time, rather than any news source representing their viewpoint?
I mean, yeah, that's partially true, but I think that although environment plays a big role, like such as if you're the only one, although you have this like a whole lot of people that supports you, if you're the only one that has that color in a certain group, then it'll be harder for you to make that opinion or stance compared to other, like relatively. But still, the big difference here is that whether that environment is like a national scale or just like a certain, I don't know, group scale. Because if the media itself becomes less it should, yeah, like less radical, or it doesn't have a clear color, then you won't be like, you'll be more hesitant to talk about these issues like on a national scale, like on a national scale, such as if it's, I don't know, it could actually like affect the votes, I guess. Or, and then knowing that you have these like you have this similar minds people somewhere in this country will really help you to make your own voice. And if you think this environment won't like accept your voice, I guess, then you know that there's somewhere else that you could fit in, or somewhere that you could speak your voice. But if you don't have these media, and if you don't have the confidence of, it's like returning to your home, I guess. Like if you don't have that home base like behind you, and if you don't know that you have somewhere to return back to, it will really, the media and the audience will have, the media will have the ultimate power to like control the whole audience. And I think that's unhealthy, like overall.
Yeah. So to kind of flip it over
Mhm.
for a moment, looking at this from the audience's perspective, would you say that obviously if people realize that a certain news source is biased in a certain way, that does affect whether, firstly, it affects our decision whether to watch that news source or not,
Okay.
and even as we're watching it, it affects the way that we um,
Receive it.
yeah, receive that information. Would you say that, so I think that could be a potential consequence of having news sources that have specific colors that don't change. is that people realize that those news sources aren't as credible because they have those colors, and that they start to filter out news sources to only look at the sources that they want to watch that
Right.
are representing their viewpoint. Do you
Mhm.
think that there's something that maybe could be a solution to that issue, or do you think that that's just something that the news sources are going to have to change?
I mean, it's always a problem, like if you have these clear colors. You just don't want, like, it's human instinct that you don't want to hear something that goes completely against you. And who would want to like search it up and watch the news? Like, I wouldn't do that either. But I mean, the solution, I guess, like a positive part of it is that you still will have a clear, I guess, awareness that this thing is biased. Because if you don't have that awareness, and if you tend to believe like everything that a media says, like regardless of its colors, then that could be very dangerous. But I think one positive thing part of it is that you at least have the awareness that some medias are biased. And if that goes too much, yeah, as you said, it could be a problem that individuals will only look at things that they want, and that will make them more radical, I think, and that will cause problems. But I can't think of like a practical solution like that we can do. Like having that awareness, maybe even to like the news that you are fond of, maybe that could raising the awareness of it. But yeah, I don't seem to have like the practical solution to it.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, obviously, we're looking at this as students.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so basically kind of to wrap everything back up because our time is up. Um, Let me just ask you really quick. So obviously our two topics were media bias and kind of raising awareness about these social topics. So firstly, could you just finish with A, why you think people should care about social issues and topics, and B, if you have maybe a credible source or like a source that you um, think is a relatively less biased and factual news source that you would like to recommend to our audience? Just those two things.
First of all, the reason why we should raise or at least have some interest to these social interests like issues is because it's the society we live in. And even as students, it's the society that we are going to live in. I mean, in for us, like it could be in 2 years after we become adults. And like if you are living that life and if you're living in that society and you don't even know what's happening there, I think it's going to be you're going to be very easily swayed by a bigger power or like I don't know, bigger power. But if you like start to raise awareness like by yourself and try to find like these social issues and try to analyze it yourself without having a biased information and thinking based on your experience, although sometimes you might need an experience, like expert information, or like sometimes an adult could help you. But still, if you have that your own standards that could be applied to any situation, it will really help you. Like I haven't lived lifelong, but it will really help you like make your own decisions, and you won't have to feel like suppressed or swayed by others. I think that's the biggest part, that you should raise awareness about social issues. And as I told you in the beginning, I don't read news articles often, and I also admit that I'm one of those audiences that tends to believe everything I see. So I mean, and then I want to say that like nothing can't be biased. So I mean, some things might be less biased than others, but as I said before, I think it's just important that you, although you might not like it, trying to listening to others' ideas. I mean, and trying to think why they think that way. That's the bigger part of like consuming media and having like healthy media habits than rather like choosing one source that could be credible.
Yeah, and I think you summed it up really well. Obviously, the whole point of this entire YouTube channel as well is not to provide professional knowledge. You can
Mhm.
look at that in other news sources. It's to provide relatable um, advice and experiences and thoughts. So that's great. Thank you again for joining us today. I hope you had a great time. I definitely had a very interesting interview. Um, do you have any last things that you'd like to say?
No, I think it was a great opportunity for me to talk about these things, these topics, because it's really hard for you to talk about these topics, especially being students and being teenagers. It's kind of sometimes awkward to bring these topics up. So I think it was a great opportunity to look back at myself, and I better read some news articles.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.